welcome. My name is Jessica Espey. This is a recording for submission 30. The title of the panel is Laying the Foundation for Effective Partnerships, Examining Data Sharing Agreements. So hello and welcome. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. I'm joined today by Dahmm, who's the lead author of a new report called Laying the Foundation for Effective Partnerships, Examining Data Sharing Agreements, which was prepared on behalf of the Contracts for Data Collaboration group. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a minute, but by way of introduction, so my name is Jessica Espey. I'm the director of UNSDSN-TReNDS. UNSDSN-TReNDS is the data arm of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We're essentially a global sort of think tank of sorts working on data and statistics for sustainable development and looking particularly at how we can harness the latest innovations in the data revolution, in new technologies and new approaches to data collection and curation, and to apply those to help monitor sustainable development and drive progress, particularly on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. One of the projects that UNSDSN-TReNDS has been really delighted to be engaged in is an initiative called Contracts for Data Collaboration. It's a joint project between UNSDSN-TReNDS, the University of Washington, the World Economic Forum, and NYU's GovLab. And the project aims particularly to look at contracts and other forms of data sharing practices to try and identify replicable, successful elements of these contracts and agreements, and try and break these down a little bit and make them a bit more accessible. So particularly countries with less capacity and the statistical offices find it much easier to embark onto partnership agreements with third parties from the private sector or academia or others outside of government. So that's what that project aims to do, and we're going to hear more about it in a minute. The report we'll be discussing today has the same title as this session, Laying the Foundations for Effective Partnerships, Examining Data Sharing Agreements. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dahmm, who is a manager with UNSDSN-TReNDS, and to have the chance to have a conversation with him about this exciting report. So hi, Hayden. Thank you for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jess. And great to have the chance to share some of our initial findings with folks.
Great. All right, Hayden, so as the author of this new report, on behalf of the Contracts for Data Collaboration initiative, can you give us a bit of a brief overview of some of the report's main issues, and particularly the motivation for examining data sharing agreements in the first place?
Sure. Well, given the space where we work, we're aware of how data collaboratives, especially data collaboratives that are empowering national statistical offices and other public entities, have the ability to support sustainable development and humanitarian functions by bringing new data to bear on policy making, and something that we are very much seeing right now during the COVID situation. But we are also appreciative of the fact that often the process of actually negotiating the agreement, the data sharing agreement, or DSA, that underpins these activities can be the single most time-consuming step in the collaborative, delaying the physical sharing of data and analysis and insights by months, if not over a year. And so we wanted to work on documenting and understanding how data sharing agreements were being formed so that we could hopefully help to expedite some of these procedures and stimulate a conversation within the wider data community about how these practices are being undertaken. And so along with our collaborators, we built this library by pooling together DSAs that were already available in the public domain, and also working with our different contacts from across the data landscape, bringing together example agreements that deal with everything from healthcare and public health data to environmental issues and education. It really covers a wide gamut, covering 5 continents at least at the moment. And we then analyzed these agreements and presented them in an online library using an analytical framework that we created that falls under 6 general overarching pillars that deal with who are the data sharing collaborators involved? Why is it that they are pursuing the data sharing agreement in the first place? What type of data is being shared? How is this data being shared? When do certain data sharing activities take place? And also, perhaps less obvious, but still critical, where are the data activities happening? And that can have legal jurisdictional implications and so on. And so underneath these 6 overarching questions, we have 49 different sub-questions that consider a spectrum of issues that DSAs regularly address when looking at both general contracting issues, but also issues very specific to data and the types of problems that might come up when negotiating these arrangements.
Okay.
And
Can I pause you there for a minute?
Sure, yes.
Thank you so much. That's a great overview of the different pillars and types of issues. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of a headline reflection, though, on, what are the kinds of insights that you can glean from the library or the repository that you put together at a sort of very headline level? What are the key things that you think people can find by visiting reading the report or visiting the Contracts with Collaboration website?
Absolutely. Well, in our report, we present 6 questions from the analytical framework that speak to real hot-button issues right now in the wider data space. And we show how the examples from our library speak to these different issues. How does the actual language in the agreements address these questions? And so by going through the library, we considered and pooled together different examples, identified clusters of approaches, and then in the report, we show specific examples that really illustrate the ways that different techniques are being implemented in various DSAs, sort of underscoring the range of potential. And this helps to show that, yes, there are some emerging practices available, but at the same time, of course, there's no universal DSA, that these are tailored to the specific context, the type of partners involved, the type of data that's being shared. So while there are insights that may be replicable, these certainly have to be specific to an individual collaborative situation. However, the library also underscores the issue that DSAs are not necessarily addressing the full range of issues that we might hope for. For example, only a third of the DSAs in the library that we covered in this report consider long-term management of the data, and less than a third address issues of potential data breaches and what should happen in that event. So there's perhaps more work that needs to be done to set standards and expectations about how we handle some very sensitive information that's being shared.
Great, thanks, Hayden. I think you've touched on a really interesting issue there, which is something which I think is very close to a lot of people's minds at the moment, which is data use, right? Once you have a partnership between a government and a private company, hypothetically speaking, let's say it's a big international company and they are sharing data about consumers with the government to help track spending patterns following a recession, right? What's to say that the government can't continue to use that data in the future or in other ways than was initially intended? How do you moderate data use within these particular collaborations? Does the library and do the data sharing agreements you've looked at help give us any clues as to how to do that successfully and make sure that there are parameters on how data is being used within any given partnership?
Certainly, and this is a good example for demonstrating how the library captures a range of approaches that can be taken and that might be considered by future collaborators. Almost all of the agreements in the library do lay out the intent, what the purpose of this data sharing agreement is, and what the envisioned use of the data might be. But of course, when you are sharing data from a provider to a receiver, there's the risk of data being used in ways that were not intended or possibly being abused. And so agreements will specifically lay out terms that restrict the potential use. And at the most basic level, this could simply say the data cannot be used for purposes contrary to the stated purpose of the agreement. And it's very broad and potentially open to interpretation, but that has the advantage of perhaps allowing for additional uses down the road that weren't conceived at the beginning, but that are still in keeping with the intent. However, of course, that does create some risks of overuse still. And so other agreements will lay out very specific constraints and spell out measures that need to be taken. One instance that comes to mind is we show an agreement between the Samoa Bureau of Statistics and UNICEF about data regarding children and the disabled, so a very potentially vulnerable group. And under these terms, UNICEF can only use this data to consider trends about groups. It cannot identify individuals, and should it by accident happen to identify an individual, it is required to inform the Bureau of Statistics, and it can't use that information. So that's a more extreme limitation example. Some others will try to thread the needle by setting strict limitations, but then providing procedures for data receivers to then apply for additional uses with the provider. And agreements can also address limitations about, say, the commercial sensitivity of data. But only around 2/3 of the agreements in the library specifically address limitations. So although there are some emerging clusters of approaches, this shows that it's something that's not necessarily being universally addressed, at least in written agreements.
Well, that's really interesting and sort of scary to think that, you know, that these aren't necessarily always stipulated in contracts and agreements. So very helpful insight. I wonder
oh, so sorry.
Sorry,
I was going to add to that, in the library, 8 of the agreements that don't address use limitations concern potentially sensitive data about students, about housing programs, about mobile network operator data. So that's potentially very sensitive stuff.
Wow, fascinating. And it's interesting you touch on mobile network data last, because the next thing I wanted us to think about maybe is, what have you noticed or have you observed any impacts of COVID-19 on data sharing agreements? And do you think there are any things that you've observed by doing this analysis that can help particularly country governments navigate partnerships with third-party entities in the light of COVID? I think we're seeing a huge amount of interest in working with telecommunications companies and other providers who can provide more data to track disease spread or so on. But, you know, what are the risks and what are the opportunities with this? And is there anything we can learn from these agreements?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that COVID is demonstrating the importance of data sharing agreements. We're seeing agreements being created all around the world. In the UK, I know that the NHS has formed high-level DSAs with Google and Palantir and other big tech companies, and those have been definitely scrutinized and questioned. And there are other instances, as you described, of mobile network operator data being used. And these are instances that we are trying to capture in our library. We've been expanding it since this report was prepared back in June of 2020. But from some of the conversations that I've been having with public health folks here in the United States, at least, data sharing agreements are not necessarily always being formed because they are so time consuming. We need the data rather immediately, and the delays that might be caused by a DSA negotiation, we simply can't afford it, at least, or some folks feel they can't afford. And so I feel that this underscores the importance of having a wider understanding of what is possible when creating a DSA, because without having an agreement in place, there's the risk of A, not accessing the most appropriate and necessary data, but B, that sharing happening in less appropriate ways, perhaps ways that might undermine the trust of some of the parties involved. And certainly one topic that I think has gained quite a lot of attention in the humanitarian sector and wider is about the question of data retention and how long will these data sharing activities continue? Will they stop at the end of the pandemic, or will this become a new normal? And as I may have noted, only 14 out of the 41 agreements that we looked at in the repository specifically address issues of data retention. So this is something that we need to have a conversation about as a wider data community to make sure that there are responsible standards in place. And these are being reflected in the agreements that are being created now.
Wow, fascinating, and yeah, hugely important that we're having public conversations about these kinds of issues. So moving forward, what do you think the C4DC group, the Contracts for Data Collaboration group, are going to do next? How do you plan to build on this work?
Sure. Well, one of our absolute priorities is expanding the scope of the library, making sure that we have a wider diversity of agreements. Currently, 20 out of the 41 agreements that we looked at in this report came from North America, 6 came from Europe, and a number of the other agreements were from international bodies. So we're not necessarily reflecting geographic diversity. Additionally, all but 2 of the agreements were originally in English. And so while we, I think, are providing some valuable initial insights here, there's a risk of these not necessarily translating or capturing the issues that might arise in other jurisdictions, you know, the Francophone jurisdictions, for instance. So that's certainly something that we want to work on. And also we want to have agreements that address other types of data that is being shared right now. For instance, we don't have any agreements on satellite data, and that could raise different types of concerns that are then being addressed in more unique clauses of those agreements. So definitely expanding the library is one priority, but also we want to delve into some specific issues that are very pertinent right now. As I mentioned, data retention is something that a lot of folks are thinking about, and we are working right now with some legal experts on preparing a brief that's considering the use of sunset clauses, both in data sharing agreements, but also in legislation that's enabling some of the data sharing activity we're observing right now. And these sunset clauses would consider how to wind down some of these activities post-COVID. And it's something that, as noted, we need to have more of a conversation about. And we hope to enable that through our brief. But ultimately, we're hoping that the library can enable this conversation that we very much need about data sharing and result in more effective, considered, and ultimately more trusted data sharing practices.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hayden. I think that's been a fabulous summary of the work that you've done. Thank you. And I think you've really raised that this is the new normal. I mean, partnerships between public and private and public and private entities where we share data is really becoming more and more common. And we need to be well equipped in order to respond to that and to do that safely and effectively. And I think you've highlighted some brilliant issues around data retention, data use, but also the accessibility of these processes. I mean, if they're timely and cumbersome and complex, it's very hard for lower capacitated governments particularly to make sure that they've got a fair agreement. And the risk being, as you said, that we don't even use a data sharing agreement, and then you really don't know where you stand contractually with the use of that information. So hugely important, and something I think the general public needs to be a bit more aware of, as very important moving forward about the ownership, control, and use of our data. Brilliant to hear about this work. I hope it will continue and deepen, as you said. For anyone listening who might know of contracts or have more information about data collaborative practices, I'm sure Hayden would love you to get in touch. as would I. Yeah, you can visit the the contracts for datacollaboration.org website. There's more information on this report and the repository there, and you can contact Hayden or anyone else from the UNSDSN-TReNDS team who is involved in this work. So I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks to Hayden for your great remarks, and do check out the report. Thanks very much.